to adapt to climate change. Solidarity with nations to secure themselves against catastrophic risk events and damage. Solidarity to support millions of farmers who face huge challenges to adapt to changes they did not cause. Solidarity with the youth and women who are bearing the brunt of climate change in lost opportunities for jobs and incomes. From our rural villages to our communities and our sprawling urban cities, there must be climate change solidarity. Our solidarity must translate to decisive actions. The African Development Bank is taking decisive actions. We increased the share of our financing going to climate from 9% in 2016 to 38% in 2019. And we expect to reach 40% by this year. The African Development Bank has far exceeded the call of the United Nations Secretary General Gutierrez for multilateral developing banks to devote 50% of their climate finance to adaptation. The bank achieved 50% parity in climate adaptation by 2018. We increased allocation to climate adaptation to 58% by 2019. And by 2020, we devoted 67% to climate adaptation. The African Development Bank's commitment to climate finance will reach $25 billion by 2025. Our financing is going towards support for large-scale climate adaptation initiatives in Africa. The bank is implementing the Desert to Power initiative to build the world's largest solar zone in the Sahel, to provide renewable energy for 250 million people. And work has started in Burkina Faso, Chad, and Mali, working with Agence Française de Développement. The bank is supporting the Great Green Wall Initiative, a climate defense shield to protect the Sahel from desertification, for which we have committed to mobilize $6.5 billion at the conference called by President Emmanuel Macron. The bank's technologies for African agricultural transformation, which we call TAT or TAAT, is working on the ground in 37 African countries in providing farmers with climate resilient seeds to protect them and help them to adapt to drought, to pests and diseases. In 2019, we provided 2.6 million farmers with drought-tolerant maize to cope with droughts that were ravaging Eastern Africa countries. In Sudan and Ethiopia, hundreds of thousands of farmers now plant heat-tolerant wheat varieties that are rapidly boosting food security. We supported 600,000 farmers in Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Zambia with treated technologies that allow them to survive the massive devastation of the fall armyworms. The bank's Africa Disaster Risk Insurance Facility helps to pay for insurance for countries to insure themselves against climate-related disasters to build resilience. The African Development Bank, Your Excellencies, and the Global Center for Adaptation have launched the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program to further scale climate adaptation solutions across all African countries. Our goal is to mobilize $25 billion for climate adaptation for Africa. The African Adaptation Acceleration Program will build on what is working and speed up the actualization of the African Adaptation Initiative of the African Union. We plan to provide digital climate information and advisory services for 30 million farmers. Through our Africa Resilient Infrastructure Accelerator, we plan to mobilize support to scale up climate-resilient urban and rural infrastructure, including water, renewable energy, roads, and housing. We will support small island states to build climate resilience. We will mobilize and leverage global finance to support the private sector. We will work to align financial systems in Africa to support climate finance and green investments, and to align with the Paris Agreement. And we plan to support 1 million youth with skills and knowledge for climate adaptation to create much needed green jobs, building 10,000 youth-led climate adaptation businesses. Your Excellencies, we must now raise ambition for climate finance for Africa. Only ambition, scale, finance, and delivery matters. Together, let's mobilize financing for the success of the African Adaptation Acceleration Program. It is time for developed countries to meet their promise of providing $100 billion annually for climate finance. And a greater share of this should go to climate adaptation. Your Excellencies, so far over $20 trillion have gone into COVID-19 stimulus packages in developed economies. The plan of the IMF to issue $650 billion of new SDRs to boost global reserves and liquidity will be enormously helpful to boost fiscal space. It will be even more helpful if developed countries were to agree to allocate a significant share of their own SDRs to developing countries, especially to more vulnerable low-income countries. I wish to applaud the United States, and in particular the US Secretary of Treasury, Janet Yellen, for her global leadership on this, as well as the Managing Director of IMF, Sister Kristalina Georgieva. The SDRs can help to also provide resources to boost green growth and climate financing as we build economies back with the triple win with health, economic, and climate resilience. So let's make a big push on expanding fiscal space. As we look, Your Excellencies, towards COP26 in Glasgow, let us make a big push on climate finance, and let us make a big, even bigger push on climate adaptation. For it is now high time to massively support climate adaptation finance for Africa. Thank you very much, Your Excellencies.
Well, thank you so much, President Adesina, for your strong leadership on this topic. You raised the alarm, you called for global solidarity, and you put a bold initiative on the table, the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. And we at the Global Center on Adaptation, as your partner on the continent, we're really happy joining you in this effort. You mentioned, Mr. President, Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. She clearly indicated the link between climate risk and financial risk. So let's listen to Kristalina, what her message to Africa is today.
Thank you, my dear brother, President Adesina, for inviting me to address you today. And let me start by congratulating the African Development Bank and the Global Center for Adaptation on the bold and timely Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. It is so important for Africa because as countries face health and economic crisis caused by the pandemic, they're also struggling with the effects of climate change. In practical terms, what should countries do? First, this pandemic has shown us the importance of investing in people, and that is so very valuable for Africa, which has a fast-growing young population. This begins by improving education, healthcare, food security. And in that context, I warmly welcome the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, including Youth Leadership Initiative to develop skills for climate resilient jobs as well as your free online global education initiative. Second, resilient infrastructure. It would reduce the impact of climate shocks and provide a foundation for enduring economic growth. Think of irrigation, flood management systems, climate-smart agriculture, and schemes like the Build Smart facility to help advance water projects. In many of these cases, these are job-rich investments, and it is so important that there are more jobs for those that are seeking employment. Finally, strengthening social safety nets can create buffers that can compensate for lost income in the wake of climate-induced disasters. To address the current health and economic crisis and the climate crisis, many countries in Africa will need support from the international community. This is critical for the region and for the wider world. For this reason, we are calling for a comprehensive approach that would include domestic and international measures. And I'm very encouraged by the discussions of our membership on a new SDR allocation of $650 billion. By addressing the long-term global needs for reserve assets, this allocation would benefit all our members, including in Africa, and it would support a global green recovery from the crisis. It would also be a powerful signal of the IMF's membership on our determination to do everything possible to help our members. Because if we have learned one thing from this crisis, it is the importance of solidarity and cooperation in our interconnected world. Let me conclude. The IMF is firmly committed to helping our members to deal with risks to their economic and financial stability, and this is why we are firmly committed to deal with climate risks. For this reason, we are already stepping up in integrating climate in our economic and financial surveillance, in our capacity development, in our data work. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Kristalina Georgieva, for your strong leadership at the helm of the fund, and also for joining the board of the Global Center on Adaptation. You called for a comprehensive approach for the green recovery. Let's turn to another global leader, Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez. I think in the last few months, you really have ramping up the United Nations systems behind climate adaptation. In fact, you called for a breakthrough on climate adaptation. Sir, what does it mean for Africa?
Thank you very much. Excellencies, I thank the African Development Bank and the Global Center for Adaptation for convening us today. As the world confronts a pandemic, a recession, and the climate crisis, the United Nations Climate Conference COP26 in November provides a compelling opportunity for Africa to turn ambition into reality. In that context, it is clear that we need a breakthrough on adaptation. And I would like to highlight 5 imperatives for that to be possible. First, I've asked all G7 members and other developed countries, as well as multilateral and national development banks, to increase the share of climate finance allocated to adaptation and resilience to at least 50% of their total climate finance. Today, adaptation and resilience finance accounts for a mere 20% of total climate finance flows. Second, I am calling on all governments and businesses to integrate climate risks into policies and investment decisions, including budget and procurement. And developing countries must be furnished with the tools and means to achieve this. Accurate and up-to-date risk information is the critical first step for effective risk management. Third, we must scale up catastrophe-triggered financial instruments such as risk-pooling mechanisms. The Africa risk capacity merits more investment. And fourth, bilateral and multilateral partners must scale up support to regional adaptation and resilience initiatives, such as the Great Green Wall Initiative and the Sahel and Congo Basin Commissions. Finally, fifth, I ask that by COP26, we have concrete proposals on the table to make access to climate finance easier and faster, including for African nations. Support for climate adaptation in Africa is crucial. I encourage all international partners to come forward with pledges to support the African Adaptation Acceleration Program. African countries continue to contribute little to global emissions, so deep is the continent's energy poverty. Yet Africa is on the front lines of dramatic climate impacts, from floods to cyclones and drought, that can wipe out decades of development gains overnight. And the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us that we cannot afford to ignore known risks. We need large-scale, risk-informed, preventive and systematic adaptation efforts to protect people and communities and to build a high-resilience future. Yet, 1 in 3 people are not adequately covered by early warning systems. Global coverage, along with sustainable infrastructure and other steps, can give the world a double dividend, avoiding future losses and generating economic gains. The Global Commission on Adaptation found that every $1 invested in adaptation could yield almost $4 in benefits. Adaptations must not be the neglected half of the climate equation. I continue to call on the G20 countries and main emitters to lead the way with new and more ambitious national determined contributions, laying out concrete actions and policies for the next 10 years, building a global coalition to achieve net zero greenhouse emissions by 2050, and in line with the objective to limit global temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I'm also urging all countries to align their COVID-19 recovery packages with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to chart a new global development path. The current model is not delivering. Market dynamics have changed profoundly. In 2020, funding for renewables and energy efficiency was 4 times greater than for fossil energy. Renewable energy solutions employ more than 10,000 formal workers in Kenya, and that number is expected to grow another 70% over the next 2 years. Yet only 2% of global renewable energy investments in the past decade have gone to Africa, to just a few countries, even though the continent has abundant and untapped renewable resources. The old models of development and energy use have failed to provide universal energy access to Africans. Hundreds of millions of people still struggle every day because they lack reliable and affordable access to electricity or are cooking with polluting and harmful fuels. We can provide universal access to energy in Africa, primarily through renewable energy. And I call for a comprehensive package of support to meet this objective ahead of COP26. It is achievable, it is necessary, it is overdue, and it is smart. Climate action is a $3 trillion investment opportunity in Africa by 2030. A just energy transition for Africa is critical, one that recognizes the unique and special situation and circumstances of Africa that include addressing a transitional energy mix. But we face a major finance gap. 14% of the world's population lives in sub-Saharan Africa, yet only 3% of global climate finance flows into the region. The $100 billion commitment made over a decade ago must be delivered. And I've asked all G7 nations to double their climate finance support and the share of grants. Developed countries and main financiers must ensure a swift shift of the billions to support African green investments, to increase resilience, and to create the conditions for scale-up private finance. And the private sector must step up and get organized to provide immediate concrete solutions to governments. Local authorities can work with unions and community leaders on reskilling and social security nets. African nations can lead the way by embedding ambitious adaptation and mitigation plans in their updated NDCs. But first, they need to regain their fiscal autonomy. At the high-level event on debt and liquidity convened last week, I reiterated my call for an extended, in time and scope, moratorium on debt payments, targeted debt relief or cancellation where appropriate, and reform of the international debt architecture. We need to make sure that the special drawing rights already made available by some countries or that are soon to be issued will be applied, providing effective support to the African continent's sustainable and inclusive recovery. Excellencies, As the continent that has contributed least to the climate crisis, Africa deserves the strongest possible support and solidarity. African nations are showing leadership. The Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program and many other ambitious African initiatives must be empowered to fully deliver on their goals. You can count on my full mobilization. The UN is strongly committed to working with you, and I emphasize the word with, to secure the support you need to chart a prosperous and sustainable future, and I thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Secretary Gutierrez. Please rest assured, we're also with you. We're very humbled for your strong leadership on this topic. Turning ambition into reality, strong support for the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. And a reminder, it's not only the smartest thing to do, but to invest in adaptation is a must-do. We need the financial resources.
All right, leaders having a dialogue on climate regarding the Africa Adaptation and Acceleration Program. We will take a break now and we'll be back after this.